of time, although I know we'll have more people join. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's today's installment of the Ostrom Workshop Research Series. This is a series that we occasionally set aside for other special events, like one we have coming up on April 14th about a roundtable on teaching the workshop. But usually the research series is an opportunity for graduate students, especially doctoral students, to present research in progress and get feedback from their fellow students and from faculty colleagues about it. So that's what we're doing today. And today's research series speaker, well, Scott just joined us. Scott, I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you want to say anything by way of either welcome or announcements before I introduce Michael?
Thanks a lot, Bill. No, not really today, but welcome everybody to the research series. Yes, indeed. I'm going to be following along here in the background. So thanks very much, Bill, for moderating today. And I'm excited for the presentation, Michael. Thanks for joining us.
All right. No worries. Thanks, Scott. All right. Today's research speaker is Michael Roberts, and Michael is a PhD candidate, having advanced to candidacy recently, yes, in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Michael also holds a bachelor's and master's degrees from UMass. Michael was accepted as a visiting scholar at the Ostrom Workshop for 2020-2021, an event that triggered a global pandemic that has prevented him from being with us in person. His research interests include public participation in the local governance of water in the Western and Southwestern US. Some of his previous research explored the role of stakeholder engagement in sustaining long-term community action to preserve water for traditional irrigation in New Mexico. I would add Michael is the lead author of a chapter in the new volume Water Resilience, co-edited by Julia Baird and Ryan Plummer and published this month. His current research for his dissertation is on the implementation of California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, with a particular focus on how officials and staff in local governments have understood and adapted to their roles in implementing the governance and management requirements of the statute. That's what he's going to talk about today. So please join me in welcoming Michael. And Michael, it is yours.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Can everybody see my slide? Am I good? Great. Thanks again. Okay, thanks. Thanks again, Bill, for the introduction, and a quick thank you to the Ostrom Workshop for inviting me to be here as a visiting scholar. It's really a privilege. It's really a privilege to be here and to be presenting this paper, which is part of my dissertation, as Bill mentioned. The paper I'm presenting today specifically focuses on the county role in implementing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which I'm going to be talking a little bit about more in just a second. This is a kind of first iteration or an early stage of development. So I'm going to be presenting an ethnographic account of some really initial findings from one specific county. Sorry, my slides aren't moving.
Yeah.
Let me try.
Just
try this again.
Relaunching sometimes.
Great. All right, so this is where we're headed today. I'm just going to give a quick overview of the context for this research, which Bill touched on a little bit a second ago. Specifically, I'll be looking at some details about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and its implications for county government. Then I'll do a quick outline of my research methodology for this initial phase of my research, focusing on the county role, highlight some initial findings from an initial round of qualitative coding, and then I'll end with where I expect this research is heading in the future. And I really look forward to the discussion that follows that. All right, so a little bit about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, otherwise known as SGMA. So this is a law that was passed in 2014 by the California legislature. It's the first real comprehensive approach to groundwater governance and management in California. There had been some prior attempts at trying to address groundwater overdraft issues in the state, but they were piecemeal and not very, and not really meeting the goals. So this new law is interesting in that it kind of holds this tension between providing the power and authority to local government to address local groundwater concerns. So the doctrine of local control is really strong in this act, but that's balanced by the ability of the state to provide oversight for these local planning efforts, and even granting the state an ability to intervene in groundwater management if the local level isn't able to address the issues that the law requires. And so really the goal of SGMA is this basin-wide planning and management. And so what I have up here is a map of critical overdraft basins. So these were designated by the California Department of Water Resources as in a state of critical overdraft. There are 19 of them. As you can see from the map, these tend to be really located in the center part of the state, in the Central Valley. So these groundwater basins were the first basins that had to comply with SGMA. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that deadline in just a second, but the idea, again, while aiming for basin-wide planning and management, SGMA still affords a lot of flexibility to local government to choose a planning approach that works best for them. So what are these planning approaches? Basically, if you were an existing public agency, many of these were water districts, irrigation districts, community services districts, also general purpose entities like cities and counties, which I'll be focusing on, had to form as new political entities called groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs. This formation period needed to occur by 2017. Where the flexibility comes in is local agencies could sort of decide an approach that worked best for them. So multiple agencies could form as one GSA, which in the figure on this slide is the left-hand side. So a single GSA implementing a single groundwater management plan, or you could have multiple GSAs forming within a basin as long as the entire basin is covered, and they could collaborate then on a single groundwater management plan. Thirdly, another option is multiple GSAs could form, and each GSA could develop their own groundwater management plan as long as those plans are coordinated. And so what you kind of see here is this going from a more centralized approach to more and more decentralized approach that entities within basins could adapt or adopt. So what does this have to do with counties? So counties are in a unique position in the SGMA legislation. So you might imagine that within a basin, you're going to have a lot of, again, these irrigation districts that cover portions of the basin, but there are areas within basins that aren't covered by an existing district. So these are referred to in the Act as unmanaged areas. And these fell to or were presumed under the management of the county under the law. So counties were the presumed managers for these unmanaged areas. Now, importantly, counties weren't compelled to take on this responsibility. They could opt out if they wanted to, but that would likely trigger some form of state intervention because, again, the goal here is that entire subbasins are covered. Now, this is an interesting place for counties to be in California. So historically, counties in California, which is, I think, true of most of the United States, haven't really been involved in groundwater governance or management prior to SGMA. And so they really lack a lot of that technical expertise and staffing capacity to develop or implement groundwater plans. Another kind of interesting thing about counties is, as you can imagine, they are quite large compared to other districts. And so their jurisdictions tend to cover more than one groundwater basin. So this makes it a bit more complex for county governments to decide what their approach is going to be. And then county organizations are just really complex entities. Unlike an irrigation district that has a really simple kind of organizational chart, counties have all these semi-autonomous units and departments within them. And so when I was originally doing some field work in California, before I had really focused interest in the role of counties, I was talking to a lot of GSA managers, which included a lot of county staff and boards of supervisors. And one of the things that I realized is that all of these complexities were made even more complex by the fact that counties weren't always on the same page in terms of what the best approach to SGMA would be. And so this is really what initiated my interest in how counties, the process that counties went through to decide their approach. So what do I mean by approach? Well, so I've got a map up here on this slide, kind of showing you the decisions that counties made. So this is almost like beginning with the end of the story. We know that 2 counties in California took an independent approach by becoming single agency GSAs. A few more counties only took a regional approach, so they only formed partnerships with other agencies to make sure that those areas were covered. But a majority of counties took this mixed approach. So in some cases, they formed as independent GSAs, and in some cases, they formed partnerships. And so I was really interested in understanding the process that counties went through that kind of arrived at this map. As an ethnographer, and in particular, somebody who's very interested in understanding how processes occur, I immediately started thinking about the different ways that people within county organizations interpreted their role and the role of the county in the SGMA legislation, and kind of understanding what that process was like. So this is the research question that's initially kind of launching my investigation into the county role. I do also want to mention that what I've just shown in terms of the way that counties in California have responded to SGMA does sort of reflect other research on how counties respond to mandates generally, which is to say it's very hard to predict how they're going to respond. In some cases, they willingly take on mandates, even when it appears that's not in their interest to do so. In other cases, they respond minimally or not at all. So I'm hoping that my investigation into a more micro level understanding of process will help us understand how counties take on new roles and responsibilities, which they do all the time. Okay, so I'm going to quickly outline my research methodology for this initial phase of the research. So to begin with, I've selected a single county in California. I'm not naming the county so I can protect the anonymity of participants, but it is a county located in the Central Valley. So I chose the Central Valley because it is so representative of the majority of counties who are implementing SGMA and who had to go through some kind of process to determine how they would respond to the mandate. So like most counties in the Central Valley, this one has multiple groundwater basins within their jurisdiction. So they had all of these different contexts they had to navigate and negotiate. Like many other counties in the Central Valley, especially, agriculture is a huge part of the economy. And I would even say part of the cultural identity of that part of California. Also, I would say that the Central Valley counties are very limited in their access to surface water. One of the primary sources of surface water is the Friant Canal. This is going to come up a little bit later when I start getting into the findings from my initial analysis. But the Friant Canal is operated by the federal government, but it is fully allocated. There isn't any new water to be had from the Friant Current. And again, so this is a very limited resource for these counties, which puts a lot more pressure on groundwater. And then finally, this county took one of the mixed approaches. So one of the more dominant approaches that we saw earlier. So by pointing these out, I'm not saying that the process that this county went through is the same as other counties, but but they share many similar characteristics. So it is representative in that way. I want to talk a little bit about the primary interpretive framework that I'm using for this initial phase of this research. So I'm mostly drawing on work by Carl Weick and others who kind of theorize this idea of organizational sense making. This is a micro-foundational concept for a lot of institutional theories. And I think it's quite useful for understanding these micro-level processes. So the basic idea here in a nutshell is that organizational sense making is an interpretive process that occurs when individuals within organizations have to kind of draw on their collective experience within that organization or pull down these macro level discourses to construct some kind of a rational or sensible approach to navigate out of an uncertain or moment of crisis. And so in this literature, there's a lot of focus on triggers for organizational sense making. So in this figure, I've represented this by these peaks that occur in an organization's life. So in this case, of course, the primary moment of crisis for these counties is this mandate, this external mandate that is somehow restructuring or potentially restructuring the way that the county organization functions with respect to groundwater. There are a couple of different forms of organizational sense making that I just want to highlight here. One of them is referred to in literature as guided. So this would be when you have a lot of information coming into the organization, but you also have a high level of control over that information by the upper levels of the organization. So in this case, a county board of supervisors or the decision makers. But another type of organizational sense making occurs, which is referred to as fragmented. And this refers to sense making that occurs lower down in organizations where you still have a lot of information coming in, but there isn't the same level of control over that organization. And so you can get multiple interpretations. The last thing I want to say about an important aspect of this concept and construct is that sense making is supposed to reduce equivocality. It's supposed to reduce the uncertainty that organizations have to navigate when they are going through these unsettled times in order to get to a more settled space. Okay, so for the county that I selected, I constructed a public meeting timeline. So this is my first kind of approach to get a broad sense of how counties were discussing SGMA in a public context. So this timeline goes from 2014 to 2017. And then when I first started looking through all of the public meeting agendas, I just made note of when SGMA appeared on an agenda. And if it appeared on a consent item of an agenda, then that is represented in this figure by the smaller circle. This is important for me because consent items aren't discussed or deliberated, so they don't offer an opportunity for sense making, but they do kind of help demonstrate to what degree counties, in this case, a single county, was discussing both drought and SGMA. The larger circles indicate an agenda item that is not on a consent item. It is discussed publicly, and so this is where the organizational sense making occurs. So I surveyed all of these all of those big circles, mostly by, of course, virtual observation, because this was quite a while ago. Fortunately, counties keep very good public records, and so it's easy to go back and analyze these things. So I iteratively open coded and made notes from all of these meetings, and then made focused transcriptions of certain parts of them. But what I'm really focusing on as part of my kind of initial coding here, in my initial presentation, are two events, and one of them occurred on February 2014. This is the first time that a local drought emergency was declared in this county. This is important in my mind because a lot of the discourse that occurred in this year leading up to the signing of SGMA I believe helped frame the way that counties approach SGMA once the legislation was signed and it came onto their agenda. So the second public meeting that I'm looking at occurred 2015. This is the first presentation by staff to the County Board of Supervisors asking for direction about how the county should approach SGMA. And then lastly, I'm also drawing on some interview data that I did with county staff from this particular county. And this is going to help me get a better idea of kind of the lived experience of this process, which I'll talk about in just a second. So I want to highlight some of these findings. So if you've never been to a county public meeting, and if you haven't, I encourage everybody to do that. They are very fascinating parts of our government at work, but they tend to follow a similar process and structure, particularly when decision makers need to make some type of decision. And this would be staff from a relevant department would make a presentation to the County Board of Supervisors. Following that presentation, the County Board of Supervisors would have an opportunity to ask questions of their staff or discuss the policy issue amongst themselves. And then there would either before or after that be a public comment period. And so at this declaration of a drought emergency in this county, which is the first county to declare a drought emergency in California, it followed a similar pattern where staff from the Office of Emergency Services made a recommendation to the county to declare a drought emergency. Why do I think this is important? So when I was analyzing this event, what really stood out to me was an amplification of the agricultural impacts of drought in the county. And when staff gave their presentation, they covered a lot of different impacts to the county, including dewatering of municipal drinking wells, a lot of other impacts. But this impact to the agricultural community is what was amplified through the course of that sense-making process. And so here we have, again, one of those impacts being no allocations from the Friant Canal. What I think is interesting here is that the staff presented this as kind of a fact and statistic. The county supervisors personified this statistic and sort of embedded themselves within it by claiming that they were Friant water users, they were farmers, they were impacted by this lack of an allocation. And then that was then further amplified by another county supervisor calling back to their colleague, but then making this even a more dire situation. So it's not just one Friant water user, one county supervisor's trees are going to die, thousands of trees are going to die. By amplifying the agricultural impacts, some things get minimized, which I've hinted at before, which is the other impacts to the county. So another kind of theme that emerged in my initial analysis of this was how the county staff positioned the county as a very focused, in a very focused role as an apolitical partner of the state to provide short-term and limited relief because of drought. But in the kind of back and forth with the county supervisors drew on larger discourses that kind of positioned the environment against jobs. And if you've ever driven through the Central Valley, you'll notice that this is really part of the fabric of that landscape. And literally you'll see signs as you drive up and down the highways there with this idea. So I think this is important because it is a different position from the county professional staff who again are trying to remain above the politics. The county supervisors are firmly embedding themselves in the politics, positioning the county as a victim of state policies and state inaction to secure more water for the Central Valley, and then leading them to conclude that what the county should do is pressure lawmakers to invest in long-term changes. I think that this initial discussion, really not a year-long discussion about what the county should do, what the county's role is in response to drought, set the stage for how this particular county would respond to SGMA once it was signed. And so here we're transitioning into the second public meeting that occurred in September 2015. This is a meeting where the county staff presented for the first time SGMA legislation, made a recommendation that the best way for the county to proceed was to take a centralized, to bring as many agencies together to have a centralized GSA. So if you'll think back to that figure I showed you earlier, this is that first kind of scenario where you have one GSA over an entire subbasin, and that the county's perspective from the staff's understanding was to take a supporting role to make this happen. This was kind of quickly refocused, and I even think contested by county supervisors who immediately following the presentation by staff pointed that the situation was much more complicated than what staff was presenting, and highlighting these local agricultural interests to form multiple GSAs and to have the county involved in multiple GSAs. And in fact, one of the things I think is interesting when I analyze this public meeting is it's clearly not the first time that the county supervisors have been involved in this effort. In fact, one supervisor was already working with an irrigation district in one of the subbasins to form a GSA through special act legislation. This is important because it would actually give agricultural entities a seat at the table, which of course they are not public entities. And so unless they went this route, they wouldn't be able to do that. So again, I'm thinking of the amplification of agricultural impacts to the economy from the drought as kind of setting the stage for these types of policy decisions that these same supervisors would direct the county to make as they went into SGMA implementation. Okay, I want to transition now and just highlight kind of the other side of this, which is the lived experience, particularly of county staff in going from that public sense-making process to the actual making do of that. And this is really the main theme that kind of emerged when I looked at this initial round of interviews that I did with county staff. And so the trend of county supervisors working with local irrigation districts to put the county in multiple GSAs sort of continued as a pattern of policy making within this county against the recommendation of their staff. And even to the surprise of their staff, who would come before the Board of Supervisors and say, okay, which one do you want to be in? They would say, let's be in all of them. This really complicated things from a county staff perspective, because again, implementing multiple plans is much more complex than implementing one or two. In addition, county staff I spoke to really highlighted the fact that they would then need to go to a future Board of Supervisors and explain why they were paying 3 times as much to be in 3 GSAs within a single subbasin when they could have only been in one and had to pay the share of one of those costs. But it's not just about managing the relationship with your Board of Supervisors from a county staff perspective. It's also how do you go to these landowners and explain to them, I'm sorry, but the policies that are in this GSA are different from another GSA. I know the county represents you in both of them, but a county Board of Supervisors 5 years ago said this was a good idea. This is another kind of aspect of how the making do is much more complicated than the public sense-making process. Why do I think this is important? So one of the things that really stood out to me, again, with getting this kind of lived experience perspective was this continued uncertainty. And I'm even thinking of it as the preservation of equivocality, which again, if we recall, sense-making, organizational sense-making is supposed to reduce, right? The idea is that you bring people together, you co-construct a rational or sensible approach for your organization, and then you move into a settled state. You kind of move out of that uncertainty. But what we see again in these interviews, which were done 3 or 4 years after these decisions were made, is the preservation of this uncertainty that's moving into GSP implementation. And the tension is still the same. The tension is still whether county supervisors want their staff to be in the water business, to be taking that leadership role, to be emerging into this new role as a groundwater governor and manager, or to look to GSAs to make these decisions and the county take a backseat approach, which is the approach that county staff advocated for. So the nature of this relationship moving forward is still uncertain. I think this is important from a sense-making perspective because it kind of highlights that you have both this fragmented and this guided form of sense-making co-occurring. But what the fragmented might be doing by preserving that equivocality is providing tools for future sense-making events. And so I can kind of imagine these staff going to future boards of supervisors and giving a cautionary tale of a time when a board of supervisors made these decisions and this is what happened, and maybe we shouldn't make that decision again. I think this is potentially the usefulness of that preservation of equivocality. Where am I headed to with this in the future? So again, this is a very initial rough kind of rough go of one county's organizational sense-making process. Where I would like to go from here is including one or two more counties and doing a much more thorough examination, not only of the public events, but a more in-depth understanding of that lived experience, even from the county board of supervisor perspective, not just a county staff perspective. And situating that within an institutional logics framework. So organizational sense-making is a micro-foundational concept that is used a lot in institutional logics. But that by using that framework, I would be able to more clearly interpret this drawing down of macro level discourses and then these like bottom up kind of situated identities within the counties to understand the underlying logics that inform and motivate action within organizations. And so I want to continue examining these themes and the relationship between structure and agency. Clearly, in this county, the structure was gave county board of supervisors much more agency to shape the discourse. I think that won't be the same for other counties, and I'm interested to understand that relationship. And again, I want to pursue this idea of the preservation of equivocality through sense making and how that might inform future decisions. So thanks again to the Ostrom workshop for inviting me here. And thank you so much, Bill, for your support for this research, and a special thanks to my advisor, Anita Melman. And so with that, I look forward to some discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. This is obviously, work in progress in the sense that you're still composing your analysis. Data collection is work that you did last year. For moderating the discussion, I will keep an eye on the participant list if you use the raise hand function under participants. I'll also keep an eye on the chat. If you have a question or a comment for Michael, you don't have to type the whole thing into the chat. You can just type, I have a question or I have a comment, and I will call on you. And we're going to start the discussion with Jamie and then Renzo, and then the queue is open after that. So Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah, Michael, your talk is really fascinating. Well, your work too. And I think you were right. There's nothing like county politics. I have a brother who's involved. He's a county politician, and so I hear about his negotiations with staff and with other county leaders, and yeah, it can be real. But you mentioned in your description of the first meeting, some of the statements that were made, that a farmer said he didn't receive his allocation. And so that made me think of some of Lynn's work, especially governing the commons. She talks a lot about like the allocation process. And so I'm just wondering, did that form any part of your research or your work? I know that wasn't really like a key thing in your talk today, but in the bigger scope of what you're doing, have you had to also encounter like what does it mean to allocate water rights in this in these counties, and how is that done?
Yeah, so and of course this is surface water, which is a completely different animal in water law in California from groundwater law. And I don't know a ton about the way that surface water is allocated, but in terms of the way that it's influenced my work in particular is what is reducing those allocations. And so how this relates to groundwater, and this is a really great way to talk about the impacts of groundwater overdraft in these subbasins, which I wasn't really able to get into in the presentation. One of the primary concerns with allocations along the Friant Canal is large-scale regional subsidence from groundwater overdraft. So as you remove water out of the ground, the land subsides. And if you're an irrigation canal, that means that you buckle. And so in the Friant Canal, allocations have been reduced sometimes by up to 60% because of subsidence, which is a big deal. I know that as you go down the canal, of course, impacts downstream users more than it impacts upstream users. And the primary reservoirs feeding that canal are coming off of the Sierra Nevadas. I think there are 2 primary reservoirs feeding the Friant Kern. So it is a downstream type of situation, but it's also complicated by this other thing, which is groundwater overpumping, which is, so it's not just that we don't have enough water falling onto the ground from the sky, but we're taking it out of the ground and reducing our ability to distribute surface water. That's primarily how I've understood that relationship.
And Renza, you're up next. And then Brian is after that.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for a great presentation and your research topic, and the approach you've given to it is really impressive. So thank you for sharing that with us. My question, I have 2 actually. One is related to the research methods that you decided to use, and I really congratulate you for taking the courage of using ethnography to do this. We see a lot of quantitative work in this context, and at least seeing that you're doing archival research and interviews is really important. So I wanted to ask you, related to that, why you chose these methods, why you chose archival and interviews as opposed to going and digging into the data that's available and analyzing it. And then my second question is related to your expectations about understanding how county officials interpret their roles. How do you think that has an impact on possible outcomes on the management itself of these basins, groundwater basins? Thank you.
Great. So for the first question, the reason that I'm using ethnographic methods is because I'm interested in interpretation and in lived experience, which quantitative methods can't really get at. I think that an area that's really underexplored in a lot of the literature on collective action in particular are intra-organizational kind of dynamics and processes. So when that's been looked at, we usually think about decisions that decision makers make within an organization as being motivated by self-interest. And so people are looking out for themselves, and so they make decisions, sort of rational decisions, based on what's going to kind of help them advance in a career or what have you. I think that this refocusing of the how rather than the why is much more useful at getting at interpretive processes. And so that's why I'm interested in ethnography, is getting that more rich and textured understanding, because I do think that it helps us understand how organizations do act in the world. And then your second question about how the interpretation of roles influences decisions or outcomes. Is that your question, Renzo? Yeah, so I think that at least what I'm expecting is that within an organization such as a county, you will have people coming at it from their own perspective, right? So even in what I've shown today, county staff see the county role in a very particular way. We don't get involved in local politics. We don't get involved in local service delivery. We support these efforts. We provide seats at the table, but we don't get involved in this. We are not in the water business. So this is a regional approach to governance for the county. And there's actually quite a lot of literature in county organizational behavior that suggests that counties typically will either think of themselves as regional or local, or very, 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 very limited in in the services that they provide. So just administrative services. And so what I think is that depending on how counties structure the types of interactions that they have might lead to a different understanding of their role, which will clearly influence the types of decisions that they make. And when they're faced with a mandate that's giving them a choice, do you want to be a groundwater manager or not? I think that really has a lot to do with how different people within that organization see the role of the county as doing that or not.
Thank you.
Renzo, unless you had a follow-up, I'll go to Brian next, and then Jonathan is in the queue after Brian. Okay, Brian, you're up.
Okay, good. Found the paper very interesting in terms of thinking about institutional artisanship and how that happens. One part, and this may be slightly off the wall, but reminded me of some stuff from Jane Jacobs talking about guardian ethics and merchant ethics and the value of both and the dangers of mixing them. So I'll put something in the chat with a reference on that.
Thank you.
As somebody who spent a couple of years attending a lot of county commission and zoning commission meetings, yeah, it rings true and neat stuff to be looking at. I think my question actually, part of what Renzo asked, you started to, answer a lot of what I was interested in, but to put you on the spot perhaps a little further, at least in terms of your hypotheses, what you might find. What does sense making, at least potentially, add to understanding? And quite specifically, for example, there's like a recent special issue that Bill was involved in. I can't remember the exact reference, with various interesting analysis of sigma and approaches and inclusion and lack of inclusion of stakeholders and so on. But the question would be, are there some things that aren't well explained by any of those models that sense making helps explain, or things that actually are kind of puzzling or contradictory unless you add the perspective of how people are making sense of their experience? Thanks.
Yeah, so so one of the reasons I think that sense making might add is a slightly different understanding is the idea that I'm trying to think this through before I answer it. Is the idea that that sense making can occur in these multiple different forms. And so what is kind of clear to me from this example, this case that I've presented today, is that a lot of that opportunity for sense making appears to have occurred in these highly formal settings, which position some people, in this case, county supervisors, in a position of authority by nature of that space to shape the discourse in a certain way. Other counties have taken other approaches where they've had more public workshops. the sense making hasn't just occurred in these really highly formal settings where county supervisors run the show. And what I'm wondering is, for those counties who took more of that approach, we're going to bring in more stakeholders. We're going to have different forums for sense making to occur in. What kind of knowledge does that lead to? What kind of understanding of the county's role does that lead to? And how does that actually translate into the policy decisions that boards of supervisors ultimately make? Because ultimately they will make those decisions. I don't know how exactly that compares to the other models that you're referring to, but to me, that's one of the potentially useful aspects of sense making as a theoretical construct.
Okay, that's interesting. And I'll just mention that, says comparing other voices and their role, which could also link to environmental justice questions, which are raised in some of the literature. So, yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. Jonathan is up next, and then Evan.
Hi, Michael.
Hey, Jonathan.
Really good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation. It was great to see you've been up to, and I thought you posed really neat questions. I was really particularly interested in kind of the way the role of the county in these scenarios, and kind of how they're situated in some cases at times as an arm of the state, but then at other times there's a tension with the state. And especially on the role of disturbance, in this case, like drought, in mediating that role and also bringing more scrutiny at times. And I'm just wondering, how are you seeing, what is the role of drought in kind of mediating that relationship here?
Well, I think that in this particular case, the drought emergency the declaration of a drought emergency as a political act provided an opportunity for these larger debates to be made in a public setting, right? So it's not just what does the county do to help people in unincorporated communities get their drinking water, because all of their wells, which are privately owned, have been completely dewatered, but to kind of focus that conversation about how did we get here in the first place? Droughts occur naturally, but the major impacts of this drought, I think, from the kind of public discourse that the county supervisors were drawing on, was actually because of policy decisions that have been made by the state. So it's an opportunity to position the county in antagonism to the state government, which you're totally correct. Counties are administrative arms of the state. It's a really weird relationship. But then they also, over time, have taken on these different roles, right? So they are also now providing services to their local constituents, and they are also taking these more intergovernmental regional approaches. And so some scholars have then kind of concluded that counties have identity crises, right? They have all these multiple identities and these multiple kind of pressures and pathways that they have to constantly negotiate.
Yeah.
Thank you. Evan.
Michael, wonderful presentation and fascinating work. So I look forward to following this as you continue to publish and present out of this. I guess I had two questions. The first was, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your coding and your interpretive coding that you did, and kind of how you identified the themes that you eventually did, and these divergences between these county supervisors and county staff. And then the other question I had is these different logics between the supervisors and staff on how to implement SGMA, going for a single GSA or multiple GSAs in the basin. Did you get a sense of how to link these logics and the sense-making processes to the IAD framework and linked action situations that McGinnis talks about. Did you get a sense that these two groups have fundamentally different logics that are causing them to think about these linkages between different collective action problems in different ways, so they're not on the same page?
Yeah, so the first question, which is a lot easier to answer. So the process that I went through for the coding, so I did a bottom-up or an open coding using in vivo codes. So this is a really great way when you are trying to not impose too much of a theoretical kind of construct on your data, but to allow the data to kind of speak for itself. So the process is you go through and you read either transcripts or interviews or even your notes from public participation or participant observation. You use words and phrases from those and lots of them, right? You generate a lot of different codes using a bottom-up coding approach versus an a priori where you might have a large concept represented by a code that you then go and kind of categorize chunks of your data into and then look for how they relate. So the bottom-up method using in vivo codes kind of helps you keep really close to the data, close to the participants' interpretation, their own interpretation by keeping their own words. So I don't know if you noticed in the sections of my analysis, I use quotes that are kind of encapsulating the perceptions of the interview participants themselves. And then once you have gone through this process of open coding, then you start combining or clumping them together for ones that relate to each other. And then you kind of keep doing that until you start seeing some patterns emerge. And then you kind of start imposing your own interpretation based on your understanding of whatever theoretical construct that you're coming from. So it's kind of trying to hold this tension between what might I expect to see based on what I understand from either empirical data or theoretical, versus what seems to be coming at you from the data. So that's kind of the process for that. In terms of linking institutional logics to action situations in the IAD framework, what have been thinking of is how this relates to, I believe, in understanding institutional diversity, it might be chapter 5 or so, where Ostrom really focuses on the role of participants being assigned to positions, right? And then how that then gives them a certain ability and agency within that position to make decisions that then link to other action situations. So I have been looking at that. The one thing that I think is needs to be tweaked in that model that I was looking at is that culture is sort of looked at as this external kind of force rather than something that you're kind of embedded within. And institutional logics is kind of capturing that embeddedness of the multiple logics that all of us have that are coming from different life experiences and different positions. Like a logic that you might use within your family to make decisions is going to be very different from a type of logic that you might use in your role in your professional identity, if that makes any sense. So I'm not sure if that totally answered that second question, but.
Thank you very much. It was.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. I appreciate Evan's question and your reply, because we can, especially in using the IAD, we can get awfully focused on structures, and the role of participants is important to not lose sight of. And also reminded me of one of the ways in which linked action situations in the framework that's called the ecology of games can also be useful. The idea that people are actors in multiple different overlapping sort of venues at the same time, and they go back and forth and they bring things. But Michael, we are down to just a few minutes here, so I want to do a couple of things. First, for the sake of everybody else who's on today's session, it's Sigma Week here at the Ostrom Workshop, and so Monday's colloquium speaker is Anita Millman, who's also on this session, and as Michael referred to earlier, is his PhD advisor. And Anita will also be talking about Sigma, but that's one of the few things these have in common. I mean, Sigma is this very, very rich institutional environment from which people can pull lots of different things to explore. And so, Michael's work on this what he's presented today on this one county, and Anita's work that she'll be presenting on Monday, quite different from each other. So I hope you'll be able to join us for Monday's colloquium as well. Second, Michael, I just wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about other counties. You, I think, quite rightly and usefully focused on telling us the story of a county, but I know, and Anita, who received your travel receipts for the grant, knows that you have been all over that valley and have visited a lot of folks. And so if you had 2 minutes, which literally is what you have, to tell somebody either a story from another county or something about the way other counties differed, what comes to mind?
What comes to mind for me is counties that immediately responded to Sigma by restructuring their organization. So in most cases, counties kind of pulled staff from one department and said, by the way, you're now doing groundwater, have fun. And other counties added a department that would, with the sole purpose of implementing Sigma, and then brought in new people to staff that department. And so this is, and which really just highlights the fact that, the way that counties approach Sigma could be as drastic as we're restructuring our organization and we're bringing in new people who have expertise in this, versus on the other end of the spectrum, which I've seen, is we're going to bury our heads in the sand.
So awesome, thank you. As people have heard me say before, Sigma is more fun than human beings ought to be allowed to have. All right, we are up against our time. Scott, if you want to either take us out or make any other announcements, well, I'll hand it back to you. Oh my goodness.
I had to.
So for those of you who are new to the workshop, this is what Scott wears every day. Actually, this has
that's it. No, this is it.
With
this is just a normal Wednesday for me. No, Michael, that was just fantastic. I'm sure you all join me in giving you a round of applause, which I would do, but my 2-year-old is holding my thumb at present. So that was very, very well done. And thank you so much again, Bill, for moderating. And I hope to see all of you again very soon at 4 o'clock today. Is that right, Bill? We have the wonderful session.
Yes.
Between the different yeah. Okay.
In our ongoing effort in our imperial quest to monopolize all of your time and energy, we have yet another program coming up later today.
It's pretty effective today, right? Between the polycentricity working group and this in the afternoon.
I know.
So,
I know.
Thank you all for
agenda control is mind control, Ben.
Indeed, indeed. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Good
All
job.
right.
Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, everybody.